from the University of Birmingham, especially on the US and the British foreign policy. We have our host, Mazurkiewicz from the University of Gdańsk, whose main fields of interest are Polish-American relations and especially the role of immigration in Assembly of Capital European nations. We have Michael Warner, Professor Michael Warner, historian for the US Department of Defense, whose main field of interest is intelligence, and last but not least, Hugh Wilford from California State University, whose main field of interest are interaction between government, society, and intelligence, especially in the US and Great Britain. I think that such excellent speaker should allow us to cover the main problem, the role of Émigrés in US policy, and simply due to the fact that that problem is so broad, we should concentrate on such important question. First of all, I think we should cover how the US administration saw the role of immigration during Truman and Eisenhower administration. Were there any changes in the US policy toward immigrant circles or not? Did Washington saw them as important political factor, or maybe as a useful tool in the psychological warfare, or only as a cannon fodder and a covert operation of the CIA intelligence, as the communist propaganda stressed during Cold War era? Next important question is also whether different national groups were treated by US administration in the same manner, or simply some of them were privileged, or simply the US administration put more stress on cooperation with, for example, Poles or Czechs, neglecting others. And the last but not least, the last question is whether all political circles within national groups were treated in the same manner, or there were differences in the attitude of US policy. I think that our experts will be able to answer at least part of this question, and we will keep an agenda. So I would like Scott to present his opinion about approaches of Truman and Eisenhower administration to liberation, political warfare, and immigrants. Scott, the floor is yours, 15 minutes.
Thank you. And if you could let me know when there's about 1 minute remaining. Can you hear me at the back? If I just speak like this? The left? Okay. Is that better? Okay, thank you. Good. Forgive me for my accent from the southern part of the United States. I always start with the idea that you see the world from where you sit. Not only the world of the past, but also where you are in the present. So I need to make a declaration that I work as an academic, very interested in these Cold War issues of US and British foreign policy, but their interaction with various communities, including the communities of Eastern Europe. But I also work as a journalist on day-to-day affairs. I run a website called EA Worldview, which specializes on US foreign policy and especially focuses on day-to-day coverage of Iran, the Middle East, especially Syria, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, and also moving into areas, for example, such as North Africa. And I say that because part of, in addressing your questions today, is to make the point that just as I don't think I could come to you and say that my views are not simply shaped by what I see today in 2014, and these questions of liberation, intervention, exile communities, immigrant communities. So I come to you almost as a student of this conference, of these excellent workshops, these excellent papers, to say how much, in contrast to what a historian, a man named Gaddis, said about 20 years ago, he said we now know everything about the Cold War. How much we do not know, and how much we need to know that is going to come out of sessions like these. And I say this to make three provocative arguments to you. The first is that if you consider the story of liberation in the broad sense, specifically the US working with immigrant communities, you do not get coherence in American strategy. You get incoherence. A lack of connected, developed thought that is implemented as an overall strategy for Eastern Europe and beyond in the early Cold War. Secondly, personal point of view, what I'm looking for is to recognize the significance not of US policymakers. We know a lot about what they did, but to recognize the significance of the local. And I'm using local loosely to refer to immigrant communities, displaced persons, but also those people who remained in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in the countries of the so-called communist bloc after 1945. What their aspirations were, what their concerns were, what their activities were, and how these may or may not have joined up with what the Americans were trying to develop in foreign policy and what the Americans perceived. And thirdly, doing those two things, I want to interrogate, to consider questions of liberation and intervention. Not just simply freedom, that term which should be embraced and has been already, but what it means to try to intervene for freedom and the complications that can arise. Area one, and I'm afraid this will have to be, you have excellent questions, but just a surface examination. Liberation and the incoherence of US foreign policy. In 1952, a man named Tracy Barnes, who was with the CIA and also with the Psychological Strategy Board, wrote a memo which finally put the question all the way up to highest levels. Are we or are we not pursuing liberation? We have many programs that point to this, but we do not have a definitive answer. This memorandum was considered by various offices, kicked around for months, and there was still no answer. No clarity on whether the American goal was, by whatever means necessary, to free the countries of Eastern Europe from communist domination. 8 years later, in 1960, C.E. Jackson, who had been an advisor to President Johnson, or President Eisenhower, on psychological warfare, who had been head of the Free Europe Committee, made the same complaint. Rather than act for liberation, we had refrained from it, we had pulled back. And he pleaded with Eisenhower to do something, a request which Eisenhower, quite tired by this point, did not heed. There is a myth of coherence. We tell ourselves the myth of coherence as historians. It makes for an easier story. It sells more books. Who wants to sell a book that says at the end, well, you know, it never really came together. It was all a mess. So we tell our stories, for example, such as the easy contrast, Truman containment, Eisenhower liberation, much of which has been undone by scholarship. Or we do it through narratives, myths of unity, strategies of containment. And then the US simply moved from one strategy to another in a very fluid way and so on. The fact is that the only point where I would argue to you in terms of approaching the Émigrés and building this to a strategy where you had the possibility, or at least a coherence, was in the document which we have referred to already. In the introduction from the Polish Undersecretary of State, in May 1948, the policy planning staff under George Kennan saying, we pursue both strength in Western Europe and liberation in Eastern Europe. We intervene in France and Italy to support parties there. We create an institution, structures to support émigrés and the local peoples of Eastern Europe. For reasons that I won't get into for sake of time, Kennan's strategy was never fully implemented. The organization was, and the tactics were, but not the strategy. NSC 68 of 1950, that holy grail of the American fight against communism, is not a coherent document. It puts a priority on rapid military expansion. It does refer to economic aid, information policy, political strategies, or political maneuvers, but it does not do so as a part of a coherent vision of strategy. It merely continues to say, we will retract Soviet power in Eastern Europe. What does retraction mean? 1953, after the US did not intervene, after Stalin's death, did not really intervene in the East German uprising of June '53,
The New Look policy of Eisenhower is not coherent either, nor is any subsequent policy before October, November 1956, or afterwards. Evolution, not revolution, is the post-56 tactic, but it is not a clearly developed strategy. And I would actually argue that that incoherence, that lack of coherence towards Eastern Europe continues through the 60s and all the way through the supposed end of the Cold War under Reagan. But I'll leave that provocative statement hanging for question and answer. Area 2, the significance of the local. So does that mean that U.S. foreign policy had no impact, that it was just complete mess? Well, absolutely not. Of course it had an impact, because programs were implemented. Vast amounts were spent on not just Radio Free Europe, but books, the Free Europe University in Exile, leaflets, people-to-people programs, leadership programs. The significance here is that those tactics, however, have to work with a local dimension. They have to work with émigrés, not simply saying this is what you have to do, but it has to recognize them as partners. It has to try to establish connections somehow inside the countries. For example, consider the post-56 policy towards Poland with local communities. If it does not, the American strategy looks to be one of imposition rather than cooperation and partnership. And this is the recurrent problem, to address your questions, with not only the immigrant communities, but then with the shift to a Europe-centered strategy post-56. That the émigrés will complain they are being dictated to, that they are being told what to do and we are not being listened to. The Americans throw their hands up and say, you are divided, you aren't coordinated, you fight amongst yourselves. Why don't you get it together? And I'm sure many of you working in the archives have far greater and more interesting stories to tell of that than I. But I would argue that if you go to the local and consider it in a different way, it's extremely important. And I'll argue this for a key reason. That is that I have been part of working with a number of great colleagues, including some who are on this panel and some of you in the audience, on the notion of state-private networks in the United States, in Britain, in Western Europe. How the state worked with non-governmental organizations, worked with private groups, sometimes covertly, sometimes overtly. I put it to you that that notion of networks, networks of lawyers, journalists, labor movements, students, economists, it is these networks in Eastern Europe and these networks amongst the immigrant communities that remain to be developed and considered. These may not have been the highest level people. It may not have been the presidents, the heads of organizations. But the matter of liberation is not something which happens suddenly. It happens over a period of time. It happens with cultural shifts. It happens with economic shifts. And where American policy was significant was not in giving a strategy, a coherent strategy of liberation, but in providing links to those networks, for example, for the dissemination of information, the debating of information. Not always on an equal relationship with equal footing. But you have to give people the alternative that when they rise up against something, that they have an alternative to rise up towards from their local experiences. One quick story, and then I'll move into my third area because I'm watching time very quickly. I was in Prague last week. I promised not to work. I was on a vacation. I promised my wife I'm not going to work. But as we're going through the Museum of Communism in Prague, founded by an American expatriate, very forthright. If anybody's ever seen it, museum, basically there is, it's black and white, and you can guess who the black is. But there is this one panel which caught my eye, which is in the 1970s. I don't know if there are any music fans there, but a Czech group called the Plastic People of the Universe. No? The Plastic People of the Universe, who had been influenced by listening to international radio stations, international music, part of a network of music in the 1970s that moved across borders, tried to give a series of concerts in Prague. The Czech authorities tried to move against them. Their cause was taken up by a series of intellectuals, lawyers, playwrights, a man named Václav Havel, who, supporting the right of those people to play music in public, eventually came up with Charter 77, that statement of rights. Rights not dictated to them by the United States government or by the Free Europe Committee, but from their own experiences, although interacting with what they observed, what they heard, what they saw in Western Europe and abroad. And it's that type of interaction that leads me to Area 3, liberation and intervention. I want to argue that there is a difference between what is basically mechanistic intervention. You will do this, you will do that, you will print this, you will receive this, and contextual intervention. Rather than directing the émigrés, directing displaced people to do this or to do that, the nature of American intervention worked best when it recognized context. What is possible within an economic or cultural system? Where is it possible to raise questions about food shortages, about problems of currency? But not to go in and launch, for example, as they tried to do in the 50s, an operation to completely sabotage the economy by dropping counterfeit currency in from balloons. By recognizing contextual intervention, then you can demonstrate, as Kennan wanted to do, the strength of the so-called free world versus the weaknesses of communism. Why do I say that? Because I think when you recognize that contextual intervention, you engage with today's debates, the questions of hard power versus soft power, which I think largely have become terms that are too loose to pin down. The questions, for example, of how do you actually influence a situation for the better without being seen to impose your will? And I'm going to make two very provocative arguments moving beyond Eastern Europe and the Cold War as I move towards a close. The first is that Ronald Reagan did not bring an end to the Cold War. For all the good work that was done by American committees, they did not end the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was brought about by a set of conditions in Eastern Europe, a set of conditions in the Soviet Union, in which people reacted to, found the space to pursue what they basically, freer economic and political systems, but largely, and I'm speaking here, unfortunately, as a Marxist, because Marx got it right, but in the wrong way. It was the communist economic system that failed. It was the communist economic system that could not basically support its projects. That's when the space opens up for countries to negotiate, basically, their paths to freedom. Second provocative point, because in the same way, we're caught in a period now where people say, well, either the US must intervene or it is retrenching, it is pulling back. What is happening in Syria, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Iran in these recent years are local peoples expressing their concerns. It is not a US project of regime change to overthrow all these governments. That was that guy Bush back in 2003, not the current American administration. It is not US directed, in other words, what is happening, nor is it simply the fact that America is completely retreating. It has an interest in these areas. But you have to start from the ground. What do Syrian refugees, displaced persons, and those inside Syria want? What do those inside Iran want? Because if you do not do it that way, we get into useless arguments about intervention, which is either yes, no, pro-imperialist, pro-American versus anti-imperialist. The story of the Free Europe Committee, the story of Poland, the story of Czechoslovakia, the story of Hungary, is how people found the space to negotiate, even though there was not a coherent strategy that basically set out what they should do. It was how people succeeded despite the lack of a coherent American strategy. So when President Obama said last week, in relation to current events, we have no strategy, he gave a statement which resonated with me. Obama was not only expressing the difficulties of America over liberation and intervention today, he was expressing a difficulty in American policy going back to the end of World War II. But does that mean there is no hope if America has no strategy? Absolutely not. Because it was not the rights or wrongs of American action that determined what happened in these countries. It was the local conditions that were the basis for what became a free Europe and a free Poland. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for your provocative speech. I think that it would lead to many questions during our discussion. Now I would like Anna Mazurkiewicz to say some words about origins of SEN and its role in the US policy. Anna, please.
Does it work? Yeah, it does. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. After having this theoretical framework, I'll try to write in some context on the and present to you the émigré perspective. So looking from the inside, from a completely different point of view, I will also try to address some of Professor Tyszkiewicz's questions. But before I start addressing them, I need to add some more, because when we do study the topic, when we look at the East Central European émigrés, the first question after months and months spent in the archives that comes to one's mind is, whose interest did they really represent? They were foreigners, aliens. They had to register themselves. Were they foreign agents working on America's soils, working just for the benefit of their homelands? Were they ethnics, representatives of a diaspora? Were they the employees of the American government? Who were they? Also, how does one study their actions outside of the Free Europe Committee operations, their personal contacts, other organizations? To what extent their activities were actually limited to what the Free Europe Committee expected them to do? Were their actions censored in any way? Or maybe self-censored? Were they restricting themselves in what they were saying, what they were doing? And also, one of the biggest challenges to all the scholars who are here, what was their actual impact of the actions that were being undertaken? We do know a lot about the radios. Well, the other organizations, well, this is still pending. This is a very important issue to be researched. We are faced with scattered, fragmentary resources. I really look forward to the workshop, because this will probably help us to get a better picture of what is where. In answering Professor Tyszkiewicz's questions, I do want to base my response on what I know best, on my research carried thus far, which is the East Central European post-World War II era exiles. By that, I mean the political elites who ended up in the United States, affiliated in one way or the other with the Free Europe Committee. The best known example to me, of course, is the Assembly of Captive European Nations, and the book in Polish is forthcoming with the Institute of National Remembrance, and in English with Helena History Press in the United States. The ACN was created 60 years ago, almost exactly, on September 20th, 1954. This was an umbrella organization, for those of you who don't know it that much. It united political elites, political exiles from East Central Europe. It was supported by the Free Europe Committee from 1954 till the early months of 1972. Later, and many of you may not know this, it did operate independently all the way till 1989. The ACN was an interesting, very fascinating organization that I've been studying for 10 years now, and there's still much work for me to do. It was a forum, definitely a discussion forum for East Central European exiles, where joint positions, policy papers were being prepared. It was also a political lobby, where united representation of East Central Europeans tried to formulate a point of view, a common point of view that would then be transmitted to the United Nations, to the US Congress, to the Department of State, political leaders of the so-called free world. It was also an information center based in New York, where people who were interested in East Central Europe during the communist era could just address their questions and find basic information, economic, historical, and other pertaining to East Central Europe. Assembly of Captive European Nations was also a way to extract money from the American government for the exile activities. It was also a symbol, a symbolic indication of ability of East Central Europeans to cooperate. Yes, we can do it. Yes, we can talk to one another, and we can put the past, the difficult past at times, behind us. And of course, last but not least, the ACN was one of the major Free Europe Committee's propaganda projects. Both sides, both the Americans and the exiles, benefited from this cooperation. By engaging in this cooperation, the émigrés, or the exiles, did not become a liability in the post-Yalta world. Interestingly enough, they became an asset for the American administration. I also want to emphasize a different point, namely that Americans supporting the East European exiles in a way, legitimized their actions, their global engagement, their entrance to the global era. John Fossek, who wrote a book, To Lead a Free World, said the American global engagement after the Second World War, he calls it an American nationalist globalism, was actually a combination of three things. A conviction of national greatness, American national greatness, global responsibility, and yes, anti-communism. But what is interesting about the émigré anti-communism, as Professor Łaptos wrote recently, émigré anti-communism was not synonymous with a return of the ancient regime. It was not longing to return, to regain significance, privilege. It became a virtue. It was a common fight against a common enemy, and therefore émigré anti-communism was not supporting the old cadres, old elites, trying to get them back. It was actually a common fight against the common enemy. And you also have, please keep in mind that these are not easy times. Stalin is in power until March 1953. There's Hate America campaign underway. There's Cominform, after all. So generally speaking, these are times that require some sound means in order to get the message from the free world across. Free Europe Committee, ACN included, of course, was an organization that worked on different fronts. It helped to mobilize the society at home, which is in America. It helped to mobilize elites and partners abroad. That would be the Western Europeans. And then the third world countries and the uncommitted areas. Because what I find in my research oftentimes is that my exiles are used in programs in Asia, South Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, Latin America. They are used as a propaganda tool by the Americans. At the same time, the exiles are advancing their areas, sharing their stories. At the same time, of course, they are rallying dissenters beyond the Iron Curtain, keeping the political, cultural elites alive, both listening to the radio, but also in exile, far, far away from home. Now, I want to make a point, because oftentimes when one reads the books devoted to the émigré politics and elites in exile, it seems like they just popped up after the Second World War. They just showed up. The war ended, and suddenly they are there. We don't know what to do with them. This is not necessarily the case. The political elites, exiled political elites, they did not just show up. They were in touch during the wartime, intelligence contact, government on the ground, governments in exiles. There was cooperation. There were people who were encouraged to go back to their countries, if one remembers, especially in Poland, one particular man who came back. 1945 to 1947, say 48, there was Yalta-based cooperation between many of the political leaders in East Central Europe, mostly originating from the peasant parties. And these are the people who are later very closely connected to the American government, who are being given stipends, given opportunities to continue their political work in exile. What is more, in 1947, we have a number of these people being helped to escape East Central Europe. And I have jotted down a couple of examples from a couple of countries. Romania, all of you probably present here in this room have heard about Frank Wisner. We do have at least 5 political leaders, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who are helped to escape from Bucharest to Vienna. In Czechoslovakia, the CIA station chief, Charles Katek, 30 Czechs are out, thanks to the American help. Hungary, McCarger, right? We have 75 people that are taken out. They're not taken out because of humanitarian reasons. Many other people got out for the sake of, and were assisted in the DP camps in other places. Bulgaria, Georgi Dimitrov, Gameto, he feared for good reasons arrest, and actually Nikola Petkov actually proves Dimitrov was right to be afraid. He hid himself in the American minister in Sofia's, Maynard Barnes, residence, and escaped successfully from Bulgaria. And of course, in Poland, I don't have to bring back the story of Stanisław Mikołajczyk, who was actually helped out of the country by both the American and the British diplomatic representatives. But Stefan Korboński, he was not helped by the American embassy personnel. He escaped in dramatic circumstances. Arnold Kłączyński here wrote about it. But when he arrived to America, he was not a homeless, displaced person. No, he was welcomed by the former American ambassador to Warsaw, nobody else than Arthur Bliss Lane. Welcomed at the airport as he left. So these people were already connected and they were looked after so that there would be hope for the future. And this is the other point I want to make. What were the uses of the exiles by the Americans? Of course, when one starts to realize what Yalta meant for Poland and how Yalta and the failed promises of free elections and the withdrawal of Soviet troops were not upheld. The promises actually carried, the agreements of Yalta actually carried no provisions for implementations of them. So not criticizing the US government because of Yalta was one thing that American authorities were concerned at first. Okay, we get these exiles in America, but how do we prevent them from criticizing us, especially that these people are people of prominence, former prime ministers, members of parliament, and so on. Reading Kurt Meyer and others, we might think that initially Americans thought that these are the future elites that are meant to be brought back to their homelands, their countries of origin. They were supposed to return home after the liberation. But in the meantime, they were very useful sources of information, intelligence information, but also general knowledge. Americans did not know a whole lot about East Central European, not only history and culture, but also economic and military conditions. They were very useful in different propaganda programs, as I have mentioned before. But there's also something you mentioned. You talked a lot about incoherence. I find a lot of that in my research as well. But also, I find a lot of evolution, how their uses or this cooperation between them actually evolved. So at first, we talk about the people, the elites. We keep them alive. Then we keep them working. Then we extract information from them. But then we figure, well, 1953 October, they're not going back. So what do? Okay, we already have these radio programs on the way. This works out pretty well, so the radio keeps on going. And then we try to make an impact behind the Iron Curtain, but we also try to use them to promote the idea of Europe whole and free. European integration is a great idea. And the East Central European exiles think it's an awesome idea as long as we are part of it, and they try to be present. Later, as I find 1956, early 1960s, they are more and more commonly present in the third world countries and in Latin America in particular. What are the exiles getting? What is their gain? Why would they cooperate with the Americans? They are really glad to get both the financial, but even more importantly, political support. They are not losing their status. They are not displaced. They are not people without a cause and without the means to fight for it. They also, getting this label, getting funds, getting political backing, they do have an access. They have an access to the Congress. They have an access to people in the State Department. They have not only, but they also have the access to international institutions, Council of Europe, United Nations. This is where they want to be present, where they want to be seen. And also, they like the opportunity that they have to cooperate because they think that it gives them the more lobbying power. They are also happy to build world networks, which otherwise they would have absolutely no means of creating. The ACN had offices and representatives from Tokyo to Buenos Aires. This would have been impossible without the support. At the same time, the exiles I studied were able to maintain their independence of their own opinions. They were not the broadcasters of American policy, but the integrity and the maintenance of their own political views had to be circumscribed to a certain point because the most important thing for them was to maintain the ability to spread their message. If they would go just wild with their visions and opinions, probably they would have not been able to continue. So there was a compromise written into this deal. The exiles had to respect US political priorities in exchange for the vastly expanded ability to act. So without infringing the exile rights and freedoms, the Americans did not feel obliged to support activities that were not in line with their own policies, right? So their support was based on the exiles' ability to compromise, this is a point I want to reinforce, and the utilitarian value of their services. Now, the utilitarian value is a tricky point, because oftentimes it was really very difficult to cooperate with the infighting, very quarrelsome groups of exiles who ended up in the West, in America in particular. Strangely enough, they found it easier to unite themselves along the lines of, say, the same party they belonged to before they left their country, say International Peasant Union, Christian Democrats, Liberal Union, or regionally. It was easier for them to go on the supranational level, transnational level, you can call it, rather than come back and form a national, one single national delegation. And why is that? I think what people who study East Central European émigrés in the West do not appreciate, do not take into consideration too often, is that the people who operated abroad, they really thought that legitimacy of their actions, that they will be held responsible for what they do abroad when they go back. So they cannot compromise their political views when they are abroad. The legitimacy of their actions abroad is based on their old country divisions. We have to account for what we did when we go back to our countries. This is what Ferenc Nagy said in his talk with C.D. Jackson when he was trying to get support for the East Central European Committee. C.D. Jackson, however, had a different opinion. He said, when he characterized American relations with the exiles, he said, well, there's got to be a separation between the church and the state. The church being, of course, the world of the exile politics, the state being the Free Europe Committee. The Free Europe Committee was a caretaker of the exiles. It was a gatekeeper, as I said before, but it was also a way to control the exile actions in the United States. The American plan to utilize and control the exiles was realized because it was supported by both financial and political support for the exile cause. And to conclude, very briefly, I just want to read to you one quote I found in the Memorandum of the Agreement on Exile Activities. This is a document from the 20th of December 1954. It's available in Hoover. And it reads like this. The reinstated purpose of the exile activities in the US, when sponsored or stimulated by the Free Europe Committee, is to further the political warfare objectives of the committee in the countries of interest behind the Iron Curtain. Yes, we know this part of the story. But then, to support the aims of the government of the United States in the uncommitted areas of the world, and to contribute to the understanding and interest of the American people in the situation of the captive peoples, and implanting them being the American people, the conviction that it is in the American interest that these peoples be free. So to sum up the final sentence, the role of the émigrés, East Central European exiles, was not only in the American foreign policy, it is multidimensional, and this multidimensional significance in international relations has got to be paired with the domestic public opinion molding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation, which showed us that immigrants played much more important role than only being obedient to American policy. Also, I think it's subject to discussion. Our third lecturer is Michael Wilford, who is going to concentrate on Émigrés, the Free Europe Committee, and CIA front operation in the early Cold War. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you. So what I want to do in this presentation is focus specifically on the relationship between the émigrés and the CIA before the Hungarian uprising of 1956. in particular, I want to examine the relationship between the émigrés and the CIA in the context of other agency operations involving the covert subsidy of citizen groups. And I wonder actually at this point if I could just ask that the one PowerPoint slide that, very good, thank you, that I send along be displayed behind me, because I'll be referring to some CIA subsidized groups other than the Free Europe Committee in the course of this presentation. And so I want to have the list of acronyms behind me, so you're not all completely confused by the sort of the alphabet soup of all of these different CIA groups. And I use the term front with some reservations, with some regret. I think the relationship was perhaps more complex than the term front suggests, but nonetheless, it's useful shorthand, so I'll be using it really for the sake of simplicity and brevity as much as anything else. Now, I'm taking this approach of approaching the Free Europe Committee in the context of other CIA front operations, partly because I'm not a Central or Eastern European specialist. I'm trying to play to my strengths here. My past research is on CIA front groups, not just in Europe, but around the world. You know, Frank Wisner's so-called mighty Wurlitzer of different front groups. But I'm also taking this approach because I think you can't really understand the Free Europe Committee's early history and its relationship with émigrés, the CIA's relationship with émigrés groups, unless you see those things within the context of the mighty Wurlitzer, this other vast array of different front operations, such as, to name a couple at the outset, the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the Free Trade Union Committee. More of those in a moment. The other reason I'm taking this approach is because these various groups are interconnected. They're joined to each other through this web of different individuals. You see these same figures cropping up again and again in not just in émigré operations, but also in labor and intellectual and other organizations. So I think what one sees is that all of these different groups and operations, they sort of have this common historical arc. You see the same broad patterns recurring in the early histories of all of them, and that pattern is, and then I'll talk through each one of these points as I move along. First of all, you sort of have a period when the groups concerned are sort of pressing themselves on the attention of the US government and the CIA. In other words, there's a great deal of spontaneous activism and self-assertion going on. Part of that story, to move on to my next point, is that all of these groups suffer from a great deal of internal disunity, which eventually, my third point, compels the CIA to assert a sort of new degree of control over them. So the sort of relationship moves from being more one of partnership, if you like, to more one of the CIA trying to really manage these various operations quite closely. But nonetheless, my final point, the sort of tendency to assert themselves of these groups, it never entirely goes away, and a degree of independence and autonomy retains, which kind of proves a considerable operational headache for the CIA. In other words, this is not a story of complete CIA control, nor is it a story of group autonomy. Rather, like any patronage relationship, CIA émigré relations were being constantly negotiated and contested. So now what I want to do is take you on a whistle-stop tour of the early history of the Free Europe Committee, of FEC, focusing on the connections and comparisons. So I'll be comparing and connecting the history of FEC with the history of other CIA-funded groups in the same period. The first thing to note then is that while A decisive push for FEC's creation came from government circles, and in particular George Kennan's policy planning staff. Nonetheless, the émigrés themselves made an important contribution to this process by pressing themselves upon Washington's attention. As the August 1948 OPC memorandum of conversation recently released to Ross Johnson makes clear, early planning discussions about émigré operations focused on displaced persons in Germany. It was in part down to the émigré groups themselves putting pressure on the State Department that the attention shifted to US-based émigrés instead. And I think there are parallels here between the early history of FEC and CIA émigré operations and those operations involving other groups. Perhaps the most obvious example would be the representatives of the American Federation of Labor, the US National Labor Center, and in particular its foreign policy unit, the Free Trade Union Committee, run by this extraordinary personality, former leader of the US Communist Party, now turned fierce, zealous anti-Stalinist, Jay Lovestone. Lovestone's anti-communism, it predated, and I think it arguably exceeded that of most of the CIA officers with whom he was dealing. A similar thing could be said about another group on the so-called non-communist left, that is ex-Trotskyist New York intellectuals such as James Burnham, who bombarded Washington with anti-Soviet exhortations until he was recruited by the CIA as an in-house consultant on political warfare. So comparisons here, I think, with other groups, and also connections, because it's in the world of labor and the intellectuals that we see the first of these connections. Lovestone helped set up and run the Free Europe Committee's labor division, while Burnham, one of the principal architects of the CIA-funded Intellectual Front, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, also advised the CIA extensively on émigré matters, including the project for establishing a free Europe University in Exile that was originally incubated by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, then eventually adopted by the Free Europe Committee. And there are other individuals linking these different worlds, many of them interesting, colorful figures. I don't really have time to discuss them now in detail. I'm sure many of these names are known to researchers here anyway. Carmel Offey, Lawrence de Neufville, Julius Junkie Fleischmann, this kind of American society figure who provided cover for the Congress for Cultural Freedom and liaison between FEC and the State Department and so on. All these figures crossed repeatedly between different organizations, ensuring that the same strategic and tactical debates were heard in different sectors of what OPC Chief Frank Wisner liked to call his mighty Wurlitzer of front operations. To return to that previous point I was making about the sort of the proactivism of the many recipients of CIA subsidies in this period, this tendency carries on even after the CIA or OPC has entered the field and started setting up front committees. Many researchers here today will have seen documents in which émigrés, approach US government officials to importune them about this or that pet project that they want funding for. Much the same tendency is evident amongst labor representatives. For example, Jay Lovestone is constantly badgering his CIA contacts for money for this or that labor operation. And also I think this tendency, perhaps more significantly, is evident in the disunity of all of these groups, another characteristic they shared in common. Again, I don't really need to tell you about the various divisions that plagued émigré operations in this period, national, ethnic, political. Well, this same impulse, this same characteristic is evident amongst labor groups. Jay Lovestone is often arguing with representatives of the AFL's rival labor organization, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. Lovestone hates the Reuther brothers, who are these, kind of less hardline anti-communists. They're not ex-communists, they're ex-socialists. unlike him. Similar thing goes on within the American Committee for Cultural Freedom, which is the Congress for Cultural Freedom's US affiliate. There are constant rows between moderate liberal anti-communists such as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and more hardline, again, usually ex-communist Cold Warriors like James Burnham. And just as in the case of émigré disunity, these divisions proved a major operational challenge for the CIA to manage. Internal disunity was one of the reasons why, by late 1950, Free Europe Committee had abandoned its initial plan of running its operation through councils of US-based émigrés and shifted back to its earlier focus on individuals in Europe. This move was followed by a softening of the organization's initially hardline anti-communist stance, leading eventually to the effective surrender of liberation as a serious aim of émigré operations, the emphasis now being on more gradualist evolutionary strategies, self-liberation for one. And again, it's possible to detect a broadly similar development occurring in other CIA front groups. J. Lovestone is gradually sort of pushed to one side, and his kind of brand of hectoring, harsh anti-Stalinism is downplayed in favor of the more positive social democratic message of the CIO's Arutha brothers. Lovestone and his Free Trade Union Committee is at this point sort of pulled back from émigré affairs. The Free Europe Committee takes over the management of its own labor operations at that point. Similar thing happens within the Congress for Cultural Freedom, within non-communist left intellectual circles. James Burnham is sort of, I guess, the Lovestone for American intellectuals. He's kind of shunted aside, and his hardline anti-communism, also his desire to unify left and right-wing conservative intellectuals, that is abandoned in favor of a new strategy of soft sell cultural diplomacy, and also just appealing to the non-communist left, for kind of forgetting about conservative intellectuals. And these tendencies are very much evident, as we've already noted, in the émigré operations of the CIA as well. So in other words, the CIA, I think, is kind of asserting its control of FEC and other front groups at this particular point. So we're talking here about the early 1950s, 1951, late 1950, 1951, 1952. I think this is partly related to the appearance on the scene of Walter Bedell Smith, new director of Central Intelligence, who wants to rein in some of the front groups that the CIA is funding and generally professionalize CIA covert ops. I think this is also to do with the fact that Tom Braden is taking over the running of front operations, and he's predisposed to the non-communist left. So I think these various factors are in the background and help explain why similar things are happening across an array of front organizations. So the CIA is kind of taking over more, but in my final point, the émigrés and other groups don't leave the picture altogether. I think some of the captive European nations becomes a tool for some émigrés to sort of carry on pursuing goals which the CIA was now downplaying. Ross Johnson and others have shown how, in fact, the ACN actually sort of became a serious thorn in the side of the US government in the 1960s. And you see similar thing going on, especially with the American Committee for Cultural Freedom, the US affiliate of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, based in New York, which becomes a sort of refuge for hardline intellectual cold warriors former communists who later become neoconservatives, and that's not really the sort of message that the Congress for Cultural Freedom based in Paris is pushing, and the ACCF greatly irritates the CIA as a result. So the broad pattern then, I think, is one of initial partnership followed by an assertion of CIA control, but nonetheless the sort of the impulses of the private citizens concerned persist. I hope I have persuaded you that many features of FEC's early history are not necessarily unique. They are shared by other front organizations. If I haven't done so, of course there are exceptions and variations. There are, of course, many ways in which FEC is unique, but just want to finish by mentioning just in 1 minute one other organization I haven't mentioned so far, which is the American Committee on United Europe, the ACUE, which is the US government, the CIA's covert channel to the federalist leadership of the European movement. And I think it's possible in many ways to see the ACUE as much as AmComLib as a sort of sister organization of the Free Europe Committee. It has so many things in common. It's originally devised by Eastern European émigrés, most importantly the Pole Joseph Rettinger. Alan Dulles is a crucial figure in the formation of both groups. Tom Braden helps run both at certain moments. William P. Durkee is another CIA officer who moves between the two organizations. There is overlap. Anna just referred to how the émigrés are kind of deployed to support European integration. I think you can see FEC supporting the integrationist, federalist programs of the ACUE and vice versa. I mean, for goodness sake, even the names of both organizations are remarkably similar. One of the CIA documents released to Ross Johnson shows how people were initially thinking of calling the Free Europe Committee the American Committee for a Free Europe. So it's almost identical to the American Committee on United Europe. So in other words, I think it's possible to see the ACUE and the FEC as two sides of the same coin of US strategy in the early Cold War, one group helping to integrate and thereby stabilize Western Europe, while the other worked for the liberation of Eastern Europe. It's not just about containment/liberation. It's also, as a lot of recent US historiography, a lot of recent scholarship about the Cold War has been concerned about integration of the free world as an important and hitherto under-examined aspect of US Cold War foreign policy. And I think we see in ACUE, in fact, the kind of those containment/liberation and integrationist projects as being very much sister projects. I think they should be seen together. Yeah, I think that is my final comment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I apologize for my mistake. Of course, it was Hugh Wilford. Thank you for
I've been called far worse.
Okay, yes. And thank you for a very interesting covering of the CIA attempts for keeping the whole immigration groups together and how they try to fund them. And now it's Michael Warner, last but not least, sorry once again, who is going to present us psychological warfare efforts in the early Cold War era.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I also thank the organizers of this fine symposium for bringing us here together. I am here, I think, because I used to be there. I once worked in the history staff of the Central Intelligence Agency, and I spent a lot of time going through files of the sort of things that Dr. Wilford here was talking about, that he researched for his excellent book, The Mighty Wurlitzer, which is out on the display table in the hallway here, although it's not for sale. You have to buy it on Amazon.com. So I'm here, however, I'm no longer with the Central Intelligence Agency. I left them a number of years ago. I'm with the Department of Defense, and I am here in a private capacity. I'm not here representing the Department of Defense, and so anything that I say is my own opinion. It is not representative necessarily of anything thought or acted upon by the United States government. And what I'm also here to mention is that while I've seen CIA files, I work now as the historian for an organization called United States Cyber Command, which is a military command. And what I am seeing is something that has quite a bit of bearing on what I'm about to talk about historically here, because I'm watching how the United States government reacts to events, things that it doesn't necessarily expect, how it builds organizations, how it builds some sort of coherence into its actions here. And so what I see around me very much informs what I'm going about to say about the past here. And really, what we're talking about, to put a lot of context on what we're saying and the excellent remarks by the people who've spoken before me, we're really only talking about a 25-year period, roughly 1946 to 1971. Central Intelligence Agency sponsorship of the Free Europe Committee ended in 1971. After that, it becomes a public-private sponsor, fellowship or partnership with completely overt funding there. So we're talking about a brief time in history, a time when covert action is the way the United States is dealing with many of these emigre groups here. And what I want to talk about is the what, the why, and the how of that covert action, why it was, how it came to be, and why did it happen in that fashion, how did it work there. And so very briefly, I'll go through that here, and we can have a little bit of time, I think, in discussion afterward to talk about this. In looking at what happened, I think it is absolutely crucial for people to remember how the United States viewed the world and thought about what was going to happen in Europe at the end of World War II. American policy is very much formed by its experience and what it saw and what it thought about World War II. The first thing that happened after World War II for the United States is demobilization. We demobilized our armed forces very, very, very quickly because of political pressure there. We pulled our troops out of Europe so fast that it was simply stunning to see what happened here. By the summer of 1946, we had taken a gigantic, for America, a gigantic army out of Europe. We were left with about 38,000 troops in all of Europe. They were essentially light constabulary forces, hardly any combat formations there, certainly no combat formations of any sort of ability to stand up to the Red Army, if the Red Army were to come west. This was so fast that it surprised the Truman administration here, how weak our position was in Europe. We were also surprised by what happened. We had thought originally, in part of we hear a number of references to Yalta and what the agreements that were made there. What we had thought was going to happen in Europe did not happen. We did not remain on a somewhat friendly basis with the Soviet Union. Indeed, we were surprised how hostile that relation became so quickly after the end of World War II. And again, you have to remember, we in America are looking at this through a World War II lens. We are looking at what happened here, and we are seeing the Soviets subverting Eastern Europe very, very quickly there, and we are seeing them as repeating what the Nazis had done, what the Nazis had done in Eastern Europe, what they had done to Czechoslovakia, what they had done to Austria here. American diplomats believe they're seeing the same thing over again here. You're seeing this sort of trickery imposed upon these peoples here. Probably some people in this room know that 75 years ago, just over 75 years ago, an old German battleship showed up here in the harbor on a goodwill mission and anchored itself near the fortress of Westerplatte. And on September 1st, 1939, just 75 years ago, it opened fire on the fortress. These are the first shots of World War II. You would have heard them from this spot. This is the way Americans viewed this, that totalitarian powers gain entrance by trickery, by deception, and then they take over what they're going to take over here. So how do we resist this? How do we resist this in the United States? We resist this through covert action. This is what we're thinking in 1948, 1947, 1948. But why covert action? Why do we have to rely on methods like this here? Again, it's because of American weakness here. Our State Department was very weak at this time. It had very few dealings with our Defense Department. Our Defense Department had just been created in 1947. Why did it have to be created? Because our Army and our Navy did not get along and did not talk to each other here. And so you have a very odd arrangement within the United States government here. It falls to our intelligence community by default to undertake these sort of actions that we're talking about here. It's because our State Department does not want to be doing things that are covert, because our Defense Department has no ability to do this here. It falls to this brand new Central Intelligence Agency and its new Office of Policy Coordination there. What you have in this new CIA is a bunch of veterans of World War II, Office of Strategic Services veterans who had been in Europe before, people like Frank Wisner, people like Alan Dulles. And what they are working with, again, they are working from a very, very weak position here. They have contacts in Europe, they know people in Europe, but they have next to no intelligence operations in Europe. They have very few operational contacts there. They have no doctrine for setting up these organizations here. And so what they do is they fall back upon these émigré communities, which have ready-made access to Europe, which have local knowledge. This is what they have to rely on here. And they also, people in the Central Intelligence Agency, fall back on American elite opinion and American elites who have European contacts to work on this. And hence you have this new National Committee for Free Europe, which later becomes the Free Europe Committee. You have this formed in 1948, in 1949, and it is a very much an elite American organization here. It is very much the upper crust, the internationally oriented people from New York, from Washington, and so forth, with contacts in Europe. This is what we have to deal with here. This is how we are working overseas. So we're improvising these operations. Everything is done ad hoc. Everything is improvised here. And so we have to fall back upon the consensus of American opinion. We have to fall back on the ways in which Americans are regarding what is happening in Europe there. We don't have really time to put this together. Later on, we would come up with doctrine. Later on, we would come up with ways to do this, and you see a growing coherence in the Central Intelligence Agency's documentation on this. But at the beginning, that is not quite there. And so we fall back on this innately American notion of how you build society and what society has to do to grow and to prosper. What you fall back upon is this idea that the Nazis and then the Soviets work very much the same way, that they are ideologies, and these ideologies are alien to the natural order of people and the natural order in which people want to think and the way they want to live their lives. Nazism can only impose itself, can only grow, can only prosper if it is imposed upon a people. It is imposed upon the Germans, and it is imposed upon their captive peoples. The same thing with communism. It is not a natural thing. It is not a natural phenomenon in a place like Russia. It is imposed upon the Russian people, and it is imposed upon Eastern Europe. It is an alien growth here. It has to be imposed by the Red Army there. And so what it has to do to impose itself and to grow and prosper, it's like a cancer within these societies. The way that it can do this, the only way that it can do this is through a monopoly of truth, is by controlling opinion, by controlling the truth, and by limiting the contacts of its people with the outside world here. How do you defeat that? How do you fight that? Again, we Americans fall back on something that is very American, which is to say the principles of our Declaration of Independence, which come from to a large degree, John Locke. The idea that order comes from liberty. If you let people do what they naturally want to do, to exercise their natural rights, they will create order out of that. What does it say? What is the motto on American coins? E pluribus unum, out of many one. How do we do that in this case? We do that by promoting truth. We give truth to these people in Europe. Truth is our weapon here. In fact, there's an Assistant Secretary of State named Edward Barrett who publishes a book in 1953 with exactly that title. Truth is our weapon. This is what we do. We send truth there. We show these captive peoples that there is another way to live, that there is another way that they can live here outside of this totalitarian, alien ideology imposed upon them there. So I have a slight disagreement with my colleague, Professor Lucas, here, in that there is a little bit more coherence in American strategy than he would give you. And we can discuss this in question and answer, and we probably surely will discuss this over lunch. But there is that idea behind this, that we are presenting truth to these people here. Now, the actual mechanics of how this is done, as Professor Wilford has says there, and all my colleagues on the panel have mentioned, the Émigrés, this is a little bit more complicated than one would think here, and that has to be worked out in practice. What happens in practice is the mechanics of actually funding these front groups was built up very hastily and in a very insecure fashion in the 1950s. That all falls apart in the 1960s. And as a result of this, the covert subsidies are exposed in the late 1970s. And because of the embarrassment that this causes, we have to sort of, we, meaning the Central Intelligence Agency in this case, we have to reform the ways in which we provide these subsidies here. And ultimately, many of these organizations and many of these arrangements, these operations are simply ended, although several of them survive and then prosper. The ones that were built, I think, the most soundly in the first place, particularly the Free Europe Committee, survive and then prosper without covert subsidies and go on into the middle and late periods of the Cold War and actually do a great amount of good there. And so with that bit of context, with that there, I think that I'm hoping that we have quite a bit more to discuss here, and I think that we're going to have a little bit of discussion across the panel there. In fact, I'm hoping that I can be as provocative as some of the people that we've got here. So I'll end with that, and I'll hand the microphone back over here. So thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you for bringing me here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation, which showed us that the psychological warfare, the beginning of the psychological warfare, was in fact the weakness of the U.S. policy, not the power of the U.S. policy aftermath of the Second World War. So we are a little bit late, but I think that we should start our coffee break, but I think that we can allow to have a 10-minute discussion. If there are any questions before the coffee, I think to our panelists, you are free. You're welcome. Any questions? Okay. Here you are. Me? You're welcome. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Mirek Chojecki. In English, Polish. I will try to Polish because my English is very bad. Okay. Okay. If we spoke about role of the Émigrés in early Cold War, I think that we must remember that, for instance, Konstanty Jeleński was the secretary of Congress of Freedom of Culture. And Józef Czapski, he, on the first meeting in Berlin, he's have had a very harm speech about cutting, about communism. And that very important for me was that Congress published few magazines like Prev, which chief redactor was François Bondy, and if we spoke about AFL-CIO, Leigh Kirkland was the best friend of Polish solidarity, and in Europe, Irving Braun, he was representative of AFL-CIO in Paris. He also helped a lot of for Solidarność. And okay, it will be enough. Thanks.
Okay, another question. Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you for the excellent presentations. I would be interested in hearing the panelists speak a little bit more about what Professor Lucas called the role of the local. It seems to be a theme running through all of the presentations, but that is the sort of push and pull between the ideas of the Central Intelligence Agency and the sponsors of these activities, and then how they play out among different constituent groups, and how the meaning and significance sort of changes depending on who you look at and what they're doing. So I'd like to hear a little bit more conversation about that.
Okay. Would you be so kind and answer very shortly?
Mm-hmm. Very short. As Professor Wilford has very helpfully pointed out, there is overlap between these groups and the Central Intelligence Agency. In some cases, members and officers of these groups come into the Central Intelligence Agency. And so there's almost this middle ground in which they're promoting their ideas to both the Central Intelligence Agency and to the groups that they're in, which is a fascinating historical subject. As I had one of these people say to me when I interviewed him 20 years ago, that he and his colleagues used to joke, who co-opted whom, after he went from an organization into the Central Intelligence Agency. Did you want to add to that, Hugh?
Can I just, because I think I understand your question as whether the exiles, émigrés cooperating with the CIA, with the State Department as well, were proactive, were they agents of actions, what is their role in this puzzle? And I do find the people I study as agents of their actions, but their actions are severely limited. For example, the ACEN wanted to have representatives of the Yugoslav nations, the nations of Yugoslavia. They were not allowed to join. They wanted to cooperate with the Ukrainians. No, Ukrainians are not nationalists. They are separatist movements. No Belarusians, right? So they have their own agenda, which is always their homeland, then the region, but their actions are limited. The independence of opinions is also restricted. When Khrushchev visited the United States in 1959, they had a huge poster welcoming him just opposite from the UN, which said, well, he's about to liberate the colonial nations. Well, this was covered. On the orders of the State Department, they had it covered with the white piece of cloth. So much for the complete freedom of action. Thank you.
Hi, and to interpret Professor Osgood's question slightly differently, perhaps in terms of the impact on the ground in target countries. I've studied the impact of organizations such as the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the AFL-CIO's CIA-funded labor operations, actually more on Western Europe than I have on Eastern Europe, in particular my homeland, the United Kingdom. And I'm struck really by how the message that was being mediated through such organizations, it would play well with groups who already had some interest in Atlanticism, who already had some interest in American ideas about productivity and so on, and it would not appeal to those who were not already predisposed towards, I guess, the American cause. So I think that, and perhaps there's a sort of message that can be pulled from that, which is that, you know, cultural diplomacy, I think it works better when it's about bridge building rather than just about, you know, a message such as the sort that Jay Lovestone was pushing in the early Cold War, which is just, you know, communism is bad. You know, that was not enough to excite our audiences in Western Europe. There had to be something more positive underlying it. Yeah, I could say much else on this question. Thank you for a great question, but I'll pass the microphone out.
I guess two further questions. I wish I could give answers, but two further questions to bring this out, at least in where I'm thinking. If only it was so simple as saying it's truth, you know, because everybody promotes truth. You know, Pravda, I think, means truth, and they say they're promoting truth, and the US is promoting truth, and the Brits say they're promoting truth, except they call it information research because they have this British reservation about being too forthright about it. The first question, when you have these different émigrés that come in, these different displaced, how much, there's definitely not a single voice, there's more than one voice, but how much of a consensus do you have amongst these groups where you can develop basically a line of approach? Because if you get 5, 6, 7 different groups saying, no, it's really this way, it's really we should be doing this, you know, that's a problem for everybody in the room because you can't devise a strategy. I'll come back to that. If you've got 7 or 8 considerations and you can't pull them together. But secondly, and I'm at a loss for this, and again, this has to do with what I observe now in different countries. How much do the émigrés or the diasporic communities or the displaced people, how much do they connect with, actually have contacts with, reflect the views of people inside those countries themselves? You know, because the fact is, I suspect there's not just a single Poland after World War II or a single Czechoslovakia or a single Hungary. There's many different Polands, many different Hungaries, many different Czechoslovakias, because there's many different interests that are at play here. And I'm sure that you could educate me on this for the next 2 days. So how much can you get a message from these émigrés that actually plays with a significant proportion of the population back in those communities? And the problem is, I respect Michael's point, and he's quite right, that the American line is, oh, these people would rise up if they wanted to, that you know, they aren't allowed to express themselves, it's imposed. But we honestly don't know. We don't have this map in 46, 47, 48, 49. Some people supported the Communist Party. You won't see it in the museum in Prague, but some people did support the communists. Why did they support them? Why were they motivated? Economically, socially, culturally? And I think that's sort of, those questions complicate what we talk about from at least the early wave of scholarship, which simply was the CIA would work with these émigrés to direct them to carry out liberation. It was never going to be that easy.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we can close this part of discussion. Thank you once again, thank you very much for your very interesting, very profound, and very, to some extent, provocative presentations, which I think will lead to other interesting questions during next parts of our conference. Thank you very much for your participation.